Hey everybody, welcome back to Joyful Homestead. Well, we're on the home stretch here, and the third in our series of questions that we want to answer when we're doing our spring and summer and fall gardening. And the first question was the question of what to grow. The second question was when to grow the plants that you've decided on growing. And now today we'll talk about the third question, the question of where do I grow these plants for them to thrive and yield the best. And so we'll get into it today. Now, one of the things that's when people think of garden planning and they think of the question of where, they always want to get out the piece of paper and the straight edge and the pencil and start drawing a map of their garden. You know, maybe even graph paper where you have it down to the square foot and you know exactly what gets planted in certain areas. And that is a part of this. So if you're excited to see that in this series, we'll get to that at the end. But the first thing I want you to do is I want you to walk through your own garden space, or at least the space that you think that you want to prepare your garden in, because it's really, really informative to walk in your garden and figure out where the sun shines, where the rain goes, how the water flows, different things like that. So we'll walk through our garden today a little bit and talk to you about those things. So you've probably researched by now the plants that you've decided to grow, the seeds or the starts, and you know a lot about them. You know how much sun it says that they might need. You know how much water they might need. You know when in the growing season they'll grow. You know some of the different aspects of the plants in order to put them in the best places. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down our where question into 4 categories, each of them starting with the letter S: sun, soil, support, and soak. So let's talk about sun first. So this is our winter garden, and it's just about done for the year. I do have quite a bit of kale still left that we're eating, but the turnips have been pulled, and we have a little bit of the greens left. Pretty soon we'll be moving on from this to some of our spring projects in this area. But what I wanted to show you in this was the orientation of our garden. I typically like to orient my rows of plants in a north and south fashion. So in other words, the morning sun in the east all the way to the evening sun in the west, and the plants in rows get enough sun throughout the day. The ones in the front, if they're shorter, can still get sun, while the ones in the back, if you're doing plantings of different plants in the same row, different higher plants maybe go on that backside. But the nice thing about this is that the plants can get sun throughout the day. Now, a second question that remains when we're talking about the sun is, can there be too much sun? And that is a good question, and it's true that a plant can get too much sun. In fact, any of these plants can get too much sun. Even in the midst of the summer, your peppers, which are sun-loving plants, can get scorched, and you'll see that their leaves will turn yellow because they're getting too much of the midday sun. One thing you may want to keep in mind when talking about the where question, if you have any choice of where to put a garden on your property, you may want to consider an area that gets late afternoon shade, because that gives the plants a little bit of a break through the afternoon and into the evening to be able to relax, because that sun is, if it's too hot, definitely can be traumatizing for plants. There are times when we have a garden area that it's just perfect except for the sun exposure. And maybe there's no natural sun shade for you. It's not on a side of the house or the side of the barn that gets natural shade. It's not on a tree line. And so you need to naturally mitigate that. And there are some ways we can do that. And one of the ways that we use here in our garden is we use a sunshade. Now, this material here is like a sailcloth, very thick. And we use this one actually for our chicken coop to keep the girls safe from hawks. But we have a couple more that we literally will hang up on the south and west facing part of our garden on posts. And they throw off a lot of shade for the most tender plants during the summer. It's easy to move those around if you have them portable. Now, if you want something a little more permanent, you could talk about planting trees in your garden. And if you have enough room, these trees, this is an apple tree here, but when it grows up and it foliage is out, all of this area around it will have shade in the afternoon and the evening, early evening hours, and those plants will be able to rest. We've got persimmon over here that's a lot bigger, and it shades quite a bit of the garden when the sun is in the western sky in the summer. So that's a good idea to use different artificial means in order to protect your plants from the sun. So now that we've discussed the sun and how to leverage your exposure to the sun and mitigate it if it's too much, we want to talk a little bit about soil. That's our second S. Now this is one of our raised beds here, and when you have a raised bed, it's nice to be able to control the composition of your soil, because you can put in as much sand or compost or leaves, green, brown compost, anything that you want in here to make the best kind of soil. Therefore, you have a little bit more control over it. When you're talking about planting in the open ground, though, and direct sowing, there's a lot more variables that you have to consider. One thing that I like to do is a manual check of a soil. If I'm deciding I want to plant in an area, I'll just take a handful of the soil and I'll test it on my hand, because you can tell a lot by the soil. If you squeeze your soil sample in your hand and it sticks together, but it doesn't come loose again, it just sticks together and stays there, that means it has too much clay. And that can be a bad thing, because that can hold water. It also can impede the root development of certain root vegetables and things like that. You might want to make sure not to be in those kinds of areas. If you take that soil and it is very loose and it even flies away in the wind because it's so light, it's too loamy in that case, and it needs a little bit of an amendment. Say something like sand or more compost, more organic matter. You'll be able to tell really quickly the health of your soil from that. Another thing you want to consider is that you don't want in the soil that you're planting a whole lot of present vegetation. That means things like weeds and things like that, because if you have weeds and other present natural plants, they will compete with the seeds or the starts that you've been putting into the soil and can impede the growth of them at that point. If you have an area that you've identified and it seems to be damp or even wet, that's an area that you don't want to plant in. Or if you do plant in that area, you want to amend it greatly, because a significant amendment will help the root development of those plants. They just won't grow. They'll even rot sometimes when you're planting in a wet soil. You'll prevent a lot of issues if you check your soil to begin with and decide even if you need to plant in a different place. The third S is the support. And plants need a lot of support, and it's something that people don't think about. Roots in some ways support, and woody stalks will support a plant. Some plants can stay upright on their own, but a lot of your plants are going to be very tender, and so they'll need support, whether that is a stake or for tomatoes, for example. Those tomato cages are very popular and they're very necessary. So what I do in my garden is I have some areas where certain kinds of plants get support that they need. For example, my garden peas and my cucumbers, I will grow on these hoops, and this is basically just a hog panel that I purchased, and I bent. It's a 16-foot hog panel. I just bent it in half and staked it into the ground, and so I will actually plant plants, and they'll viney plants. They'll grow up here and basically cover to the top during the summer months. They get plenty of sun and they have the support that they need. Other ways you can support are, like I said, your stakes or your tomato cages. You may also want to consider using string and having string strung across between two posts, and then your plants can grow up between that. A lot of people use old trellises, that sort of thing. In the back of a garden box, you can put a trellis piece right back in the back of that, or a fence piece, and you can grow a lot of things up farther and vertical in that box, and even save yourself some room if you have limited space. The fourth S is the word soak. And I know I cheated a little bit to make it an S, but it's basically water. Making sure there's enough water for your plants. We've got some cilantro here that overwintered, a little bit of parsley. Oh look, we have some dead nettle that's growing up. We like to leave that in certain places in the garden. It's a weed, but we eat it in salads later in the spring, and it's great nutrition. Anyway, water is one of the most important things for your plants, and most garden plants will need about 1 inch of water per week. Not all of that 1 inch of water is going to come from rainfall. Of course, there are going to be drier periods of your spring and summer. So you'll need to augment that with a watering can or a garden hose. One of the things you want to consider when identifying a place to put your garden is how will you get that extra water to your garden. If your garden is too far away from your spigot and your house and you need a 300-foot garden hose, it's probably not ideal. You want to put it in a place where you can get well water, you can get house water to it really quickly. If you have a very large garden, watering cans like this are not going to be really practical. Maybe a little bit in your garden boxes, but if you have a smaller garden boxes or pots, a watering can is just perfect. We'll be going inside in a moment to do a little bit of diagramming with a pen and paper and figuring out your garden plan. But I wanted, just as an end to our garden tour here, to I guess challenge you to be a little bit whimsical, a little bit creative when it comes to your planting. We don't always have to plant in rows, and we don't always have to plant traditionally. For example, I have this old wheelbarrow vessel that I went ahead and I just put compost and different things in. I started to do some earthworms in here, and then I started to grow carrots and herbs in here. It's just a little place in the garden. It's a little bit of a different change of pace. It's not a traditional row, but it will work real well. Another creative way that you can answer the question of where might be something like these hanging planters. Maybe you have a balcony area or a patio area and you're very short on space. You can think about going vertical, and you can plant things in here, flowers if you're enjoying those, or in our case, we've done strawberries. And these strawberries will bloom out here in the spring. We've got about a dozen of them that we hang from trees, we hang from posts here at the corner of the garden, we hang from our hanging hoop area, and it's really enjoyable to be able to introduce more yield to the garden, but not use a lot of space. And now comes the fun part where we take a pencil and paper. You've identified your garden in terms of soil, sun, support, and soak. You maybe walked through your area and identified those things, or maybe you already know exactly where you want to plant. And now it's time to put your plans on paper. The importance of a visual plan is simply one that you can follow. It's easy to forget what we thought or some ideas that we had, and therefore putting them on paper will help us to remember what we did. I suggest that you do a plan that's visual, do a plan that is simple, and do a plan that's able to be executed well and quickly. Right now, we'll put some visuals up on the screen to show you what a model garden might look like. First, you want to identify the shape and the size of your garden. You may want to use graph paper, but you want to try to get it a little bit to size. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's a plan. It's not an exact map. Then you want to orient your garden in terms of the sun. How do you want the sun to shine, and where do you want the rows or the boxes to shine to be in order to get the most sunshine in the day, or even to get some shade in the afternoon or evening hours? That's really important. Another thing you want to consider is where's the source of the water. So mark that on your plan as well. Or mark areas of the garden area that might be too wet for certain kinds of plants or too swampy to be able to plant at all. Mark those so that you know where they are. Also, mark any trees or shrubs that you planted or plan to plant in your garden. Again, like we said earlier, some of these will be really helpful in order to throw shade or that sort of thing. So you want to consider where those are going to be in your garden as well. Also, any other types of things, like for example, hoops or different kinds of beds or planters. You want to mark those in your garden as well. As many different places to plant as possible. Try to make your map as complete as possible, your plan as complete as possible without getting too complicated. Finally, now it's time to layer in your plants. And so this is the fun part where you get to choose where the plants that you've chosen get to grow. And you have multiple places now that you've identified in your garden, whether they're boxes or they're rows or they're patches, and you can go ahead and start putting those into your plan. Remember that you've got a spring, a summer, and a fall garden. So you have the opportunity to plant a spring crop in a space, and then a summer crop in that same space, and then a fall crop in the same space as well. You might want to consider growing multiple crops in the same space, maybe staggering in one row or one little patch in order to have biodiversity in your garden. I would recommend very highly not to put the same vegetable or the same plant in the same part of the garden all of the time. Because what that'll do is that'll leach certain nutrients out of the soil and those won't be replenished. Instead, if you rotate through different kinds of crops, maybe a leafy green vegetable followed by a root vegetable followed by a brassica, you will find that your plants will tend to be healthier over a long period of time. Of course, adding to the soil, whether it's the compost or natural fertilizers, is a great way to keep your soil thriving. And then the last thing is maybe a fifth S, and I'm going to use the word sleep so you can remember the 4 S's and then a fifth one, sleep. What I mean by this is rest. You want to try, if you can, to schedule in a rest period for every part of your garden. It's really good for the soil to rest and maybe have compost laid on top of it, leaves or whatever, and nothing growing there, nothing yielding, so that area can go into fallow for a while. That will really help out your garden. If you have enough space, it's a great way to work. I sometimes will have as much as 25% of my garden not doing anything, just resting. And it's an important concept to think about. Let me share with you a sample of a garden plan that I had for my garden last year. It's not fancy, it's very simple. It's just pencil and paper. It is to scale, and basically I just use symbols like lines for rows, and then these hoops here, that's my vertical hoops, garden boxes, and each one of these areas is numbered. Some features like trees that I have over here are also included in this, and each numbered area is a planting area. I know the orientation of my sun was down here on this side of the garden, so I oriented everything north and south like that. Then on this piece of paper, I just noted the different areas of planting, the numbers that correspond to the areas on the other page. And I put a spring, a summer, and a fall crop in each area. So throughout the season, I knew what was supposed to be growing in that area, what was to be grown next, and how to prepare for those as well. Some of these areas, if you can see, have circles that have blanks in them. Those are areas that I purposefully left blank at those times so that they could have a little bit of rest time. So you can build that in your plan as well. This is very simple, it's very visual, it's very easy for me to execute, and I know exactly the next steps in my process. Now, you may not be too keen on using a pencil and paper for your garden plan. You may be more interested in doing something online. There is an app called Seed Time, and Heidi has mentioned it a little earlier in this video. We played around with the free version some, but I understand that the upgraded version has a way that you'll be able to draw out professionally your garden design. That might be more your style, or there might be another app online that you can use. But regardless of what you do, you want to make sure that you have a visual plan. You want to be able to draw it out or plot it out. You want it to be simple, and you want it to be able to be executed through the season to understand what your garden will look like at the different turning points and transitions of the year. We've really enjoyed this garden series, answering the questions of what to grow, when to grow it, and where to grow it. I hope you have been informed, I hope you've been entertained, and we love this community. Have a great gardening season.